Hello and welcome to the MIT SDM Systems Thinking webinar series. My name is Lois Slavin. I'm SDM's Communications Director and I will be your host for today. SDM stands for System Design and Management, which is MIT's master's program for mid-career professionals, offered jointly by MIT Sloan School of Management and the School of Engineering. SDM offers an education that focuses on integrating the technical, business, and socio-political components of complex challenges using systems thinking. SDM graduates earn an MS in Engineering and Management from MIT. The MIT SDM Systems Thinking webinar series features research conducted by SDM faculty, alumni, students, and industry partners. The series is designed to disseminate information on how to apply systems thinking to address engineering, management, and socio-political components of complex challenges in virtually any domain. Recordings from prior SDM webinars can be accessed and viewed on demand at sdm.mit.edu. You will be sent a link to the recording of today's webinar in about 1 week, along with the speaker's contact information. Today's webinar will be presented by Suzanne Livingston. Suzanne is a product manager at IBM and an SDM alumna. The title of her presentation is Understanding and Measuring the Impact of Enterprise Social Software on Business Practices. And with that, I hand the presentation over to Susie.
Thank you so much, Lois. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. I'm very happy today to have the opportunity to talk with you about some of the research that I've been doing for the last few years and how that is related to both my work at IBM as well as my work at MIT SDM. So let's get started. Just a little bit of legalese up front. So the content of this presentation is a summary of the research I conducted for my graduate thesis at MIT. Any of the content that I've shared in here, I do need to ask all of you who are watching it that it cannot be reproduced without permission from the participants, the participating companies in my research. So you're going to see that there's a number of companies who've been involved. So if you're interested in using the information, that's great, but you do need to reach out to me so that I can get the proper permissions in place. Legal disclaimer over. A little bit about me. So I am a group product manager at IBM. In IBM, we have a division that creates enterprise social and collaborative technologies. I have been a product manager in social software for businesses for 8 years, and I've recently also taken in product management responsibilities for our mail, messaging, meetings, audio, video, and cognitive technologies as well as our social. I graduated this summer from MIT's SDM program with an engineering management master's. While at MIT, I founded the Product Management Club, which I know is still going strong, and I also helped teach product management at Harvard Business School. If you're interested in reaching out to me, my contact information is at the bottom of the slide. My website is susie.tk. You can also access from there a copy of my thesis, and you can always feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. So let's get started. So part of my motivation for doing this work is some work that actually IBM had produced a couple years ago. What we had been finding in our discussions with various companies is that organizational leaders have been depending on technology to meet their business objectives, nothing new there. But they were starting to change their focus from using technology as an execution tool, so think of helping get your processes running more smoothly, to using it as more of a strategic enabler, actually changing the business models of these organizations based on technologies that are now available to them. And so out of that insight from our research organization, there were 2 trends that came about that are helping to push this forward. One of those trends is around organizations engaging their customers and helping develop a business strategy. So this is actually especially true with product and service development. So rather than wait for, a product to be released into market, organizations are actually engaging customers and potential customers earlier on and designing and developing new products and services. And that customer engagement is becoming a top priority for organizational leadership, who's hoping that, those stronger client relationships are going to lead to tighter customer loyalty and new product ideas and even new business model ideas. And that trend's going to continue over the next 3 to 5 years, according, again, to some of the research that IBM has conducted. In addition to that, organizations are taking business processes, learning how to adapt them to gain efficiencies as they have always been doing, but now they're using technology as a way to help visualize those processes and get them to be shared, best practices to be shared among their organizations. So it's the technology is now helping make it more effective in achieving their desired business results. So they're continually evaluating performance of their operations, creating new processes, again, evaluating overall performance and using technology to help them do that more effectively. So how does all that relate to social software? Well, they almost seem like parallel thoughts, but hopefully you'll see through the course of this presentation how they're related. So over the last 10 years or so, social technologies, as I'm sure many of you have experienced yourself personally, have almost come to dominate our everyday life. And user adoption of social technologies has continued to increase, quite steadily. If you look back at the sort of infancy time frame, 2002, Friendster and other sites like it, gained users very quickly. I think Friendster claimed to gain 3 million users within its first few months of going live, and they quickly got usurped by MySpace, and then Facebook, who then doubled usage just by 2009. So in a period of 7 years, going from, 3 million users to over 6 million. And now today, if we look at this year, 2015, user statistics are not measured in millions, they're measured in billions. So the number of social network users has grown to just shy of 1 billion in 2010, and it was expected to reach 2 billion by 2016. So there's massive amounts of adoption of social technology on the consumer side, as we use in our day-to-day lives. And a lot of those technologies are being utilized as a way to help create efficiencies and promote usage within companies and within organizations. In fact, many of the technologies that you're familiar with on the consumer side are being leveraged inside of businesses to help them work more effectively, communicate more effectively with each other, share knowledge, harness ideas, grow their customers, be more in tune with customer needs. And so as social technologies grow in terms of the consumer side, we're also seeing their adoption grow on the business side. Hence, my introduction earlier, I create these tools as a vendor to help companies gain the benefits of using social technologies in their workplace. And so these are a sampling of some of the technologies that we've seen grow from a business standpoint. You can really use this to encapsulate a number of things: forums, video sharing, discussions, collaboration, document sharing, collaborative wikis, URL sharing, etc. And a number of technologies continue to grow and push us forward in that category. So why do this research at this point? Well, so for the last 12 years or so, I've been building social software for organizations with the goal of helping them interact and connect and perform better. But what I have been finding is that many organizations struggle to articulate just what is the impact that these technologies are having in their workplaces. They see that there is benefit, they may see case studies from other companies and want to have those benefits themselves, but they often don't have a clear understanding of how much of an impact social technology has actually had on their business. And so I believe that there are strategies that companies can employ to help improve social software adoption and also help understand what the benefit of using these tools are within their organization. So 3 of the questions I heard coming up with my customers, people who weren't my customers, as well, folks who are in charge of potentially buying these tools for their organization, is, there were three questions that needed to be answered. Has this technology investment been worthwhile for them? Which areas of their company gained value from that investment? And, which areas of their company have not seen any improvement as a result of the investment? So they would know, these would help them know where to focus their attention with using these technologies, and also understand where the major benefits had been coming from, so that they could share that and potentially see those benefits in other places in the organization. So to help me understand the answers to these questions, I conducted a series of case studies. So I worked with 5 organizations that had adopted social technology at work and had articulated verbally and anecdotally that there was some positive benefit on their business process, but hadn't quite been able to articulate just what that was. I worked with them to assess the impact of the social technologies on those business processes. I evaluated some adoption strategies that worked for those organizations and for some other organizations in general, and then identified a framework on how to identify what parts of an organization are benefiting, what are those benefits within a business process, and how to assess performance over time. And to do that, I am indebted to the 5 organizations that I worked with to better understand the answers to these questions, conducted interviews with either their executive leadership or business process leadership, those who ran a particular part of the organization where social was adopted. I also reached out to users of the technology who were a part of various business processes that we studied. And then I also spoke with community managers, people who were in the role of helping others gain benefit from using these tools. So let's get into some of the case studies, because I think that's where a lot of your questions may come from. So the first case study is from a company called Cemex. They're a global building materials company that provides products and services throughout the Americas, Europe, Africa, and the Middle East and Asia. They produce, distribute, and sell cement, ready-mix concrete, building materials in more than 50 countries, and they actually have trade relationships in about 108 different countries. They're one of the leading cement manufacturers in the world. They employ about 43,000 people worldwide. And the problem they were experiencing is that they wanted to become more flexible in their operations. They wanted to be more creative in their commercial offerings, more sustainable in their use of resources, and more innovative in how they conduct global business, and on top of that, more efficient in how they allocate their capital. So these were some major initiatives that were identified by their leadership team. And in order to accomplish these types of goals, they developed an approach that included more of a cross-company innovation initiative. So whenever they had a large-scale initiative that cut across the company, they would call these innovation initiatives, and then the company would sort of rally around that concept and push it forward. So one of the business functions that was a part of this transition and was one of these companies' innovation initiatives was alternative fuels. So they had been using a significant amount of fossil fuels in their production, and they wanted to move to using alternative fuels as a means of producing their products. So a global innovation initiative for alternative fuels was begun. They wanted to stabilize the company's long-term energy costs, reduce the use of fossil fuels, and move to alternative fuels, and even lower the cost. So this initiative, in addition to having major impact on Cemex's own processes, they also saw this as a way to reduce their environmental impact to the planet. So it was a major initiative. When Cemex does a global operation, it also has to comply with local regulations, such as client needs and laws, and they would deploy teams of experts to newly acquired companies to train people on their standards and their practices. So these experts, they typically were mid-managers who understood their business processes, and they were able to teach staff within newly acquired organizations. They had deep subject matter expertise, they had visibility of the day-to-day work being performed, and they ended up sending these mid-level managers abroad with each new acquisition. Sometimes these folks would leave their home offices for up to a year in order to fully complete the integration. So you can imagine doing a global initiative like this and sending an entire team to go help bring it to success in a particular geography. So while there are many benefits to doing that, working on site with people, establishing relationships, there are many drawbacks. People were brought in from different global locations. They were immersed in full-time projects. They left their regular roles behind, which generated potential complications due to their absence. But then they, were also, their work was viewed as highly valuable. However, very few people outside their teams understood what their contributions were in these special projects, and so it didn't have as much visibility as needed in order to gain momentum across the company. So I'm just going to leave you at a cliffhanger on each of these case studies, because we're going to get into the results of how they change from these issues when we get into the results section. So that's the situation at CEMEX. Now let's talk about another case study, or introduce you another company, Bosch. The Bosch Group comprises of Robert Bosch and has more than 360 subsidiaries in about 50 countries. And their products and services are designed to improve the quality of life by providing solutions that are innovative and beneficial. And they actually coined their tagline, Bosch is invented for life. One of the organizations is Bosch Diesel Systems. They're a part of their automotive division, and that's the folks that I worked with on this particular project. They had a process for what we call localization requests. So any of their customers, and these would also include their suppliers, anyone external to Bosch, they would make a request for Bosch to open a new facility. There would be some benefit to have them closer or more local to the organization that's requesting it. And so whenever they would make these types of requests to have Bosch open a new facility, Bosch would take that request seriously and would go and evaluate what's the business case for doing that. So they had seen some inefficiencies in this process and wanted to, gain some efficiencies from it. So the way this process would work is you'd begin with a customer inquiry, and that's the diagram on the lower right-hand side. I'll just summarize it for you at a high level. So they would start with a customer inquiry, and then various different departments within Bosch Automotive or Bosch Diesel Systems would be involved in evaluating that particular location request. The sales team would prepare documents to help understand the client need more effectively. A business unit team would prepare the business case for evaluating the location that's being requested. What are the financials? What are the issues related to that location? The manufacturing and then purchasing areas would become involved to align their own respective strategies. And then a feasibility business case would be prepared. And once all of these evaluations had occurred, a reply would then go back out to, the internal team, so the internal stakeholders, to come to agreement. And if it was approved, then that response would get documented and communicated back to the customer. And it sounds simple at a high level, right? But it ends up being quite a challenge to manage. The main communication channel for sharing the information was email. And there were a large number of questions that went back and forth in email. In fact, in one location request, there were 61 emails shared across 6 customer location requests in a 3-month period. And the volume was quite high for the stakeholders that were involved. There were 9 stakeholders typically and up to 24 people involved in a location request. So it took, in this case, 4 to 8 weeks on average to channel through the process end to end, which is a long time for the client to wait. And imagine waiting 2 months to find out the answer to your question. And so they decided this was a process that needed to evolve. We needed to have better service to their customers. They wanted a fast, reliable, satisfying response. So then the next case study is with the Customs Administration of the Netherlands. So each year, millions of tons of goods enter and leave the Netherlands. What the Customs Administration has to take political, policy-related legal guidelines into account when inspecting the goods that cross the border. These guidelines are stipulated on both the European and the national level, and the goal of the Customs Administration is to perform the inspection tasks effectively and efficiently with the aim of limiting the barriers for business traffic. So they don't want to get in the way of doing business, but they do need to make sure that the content that's being brought across the borders complies with their policies. So in 2009, the customs officers themselves identified several areas where their day-to-day work could be improved. Now, these officers are the ones who deal with the unknown goods. They are the ones who have to know the local rules. They have to have the knowledge to assess whether goods can be brought across the border, and they also are under time pressure whenever conducting inspections. And they actually physically drive most of their day from the office to go and pick up paperwork forms, describe what their assignments are for the day, and then they might leave the office to go to an assigned location where they're going to conduct inspections, such as a seaport or an airport or a land location. And while they're doing these inspections, they need expertise. They aren't the ones who know everything about every potential product that's getting transferred under the sun here. So they might need guidance on, for example, medications. Is this medication something that we allow or that we don't allow? Or, for example, organic materials or other hazardous goods. And so they need guidance from those who are considered subject matters on these various areas. That interaction could take a significant amount of time for them, often having to potentially even go back to the office in order to find that information, and that would delay the business from being able to get their content and their goods across the border. So in addition to that, they had little interaction with other officers in any of the other regions that they dealt with, so they were very regionally specific. For example, if I'm representing one region, I might know who to talk to within my region only, but there may be a subject matter expert on medication in another region that I could talk to find out if this is a viable transaction. And if I don't know who they are, I don't actually benefit from their knowledge. So they also saw that there was definitely room for improvement in that process. So let's do the last two case studies. I'll give you a quick summary of them. And so one was with the Salvation Army, and another was with a company that I will refer to as Alpha Software. That's their fictitious name. They asked to be anonymous for the purpose of our document here. So the Salvation Army, case study 4, they're a Christian organization based in London. They operate worldwide. They're sort of structured in a quasi-military fashion. They use military roles such as soldiers and officers. And they have an IT department, of course, and that IT department is a worldwide organization with 5,000 people. They conducted their very first conference in Europe for IT employees of the Salvation Army to be attended by employees, administrators, managers, so that they could share best practices amongst themselves. And this process is around making the act of planning a conference more effective. So they would plan this conference. The planning team involved a number of people. They were based in the Netherlands, where they physically met in the office to coordinate efforts. They would rely on things like video chat, phone, or email. They had various time zone differences. They were resource constrained in their operations, and they would work on tasks they preferred to work on their tasks rather than spend time in meetings. But of course, planning a major event, they were spending a lot of their time in meetings, and they saw that there could be some significant improvement to this process. And finally, case study 5, Alpha Software. They're based in the United States, offices worldwide. They have customers that operate in various sectors like financial services, insurance, healthcare, et cetera. And one of their core functions, as is true with many software companies, is providing customer support to clients who are facing issues with software in terms of installation, configuration, or usage. So whenever a client would submit a new issue to Alpha, a customer support engineer is then assigned and expects to come up with a troubleshooting approach based on diagnostic steps from the customer's description in the service request. And those support engineers, their success in providing the service depends, greatly on the experience level and comfort of thinking on their feet and getting to the root of the difficulties. So they are challenged in solving technology issues and by their limited access to information on how to resolve them. So the customer support engineers, they would report some frustrations with the customer support process in general. For example, quote, "It's impossible to understand everything about the problem. I did not write the code." Quote, "It's hard to get to the right people to provide input on ideas." And quote, "Working directly with subject matter experts is a great learning experience. Being forced to fumble through all the code and then chase people to get the right eyes on it was frustrating." So they certainly saw that, you know, customer problems are complex. There are people who are experts at resolving those customer problems. Finding out who they were was the challenge. Going through the various levels of support and ensuring the right folks are involved in resolving the customer situation was also challenging. Sometimes getting back to the client would take a significant amount of time, and root cause analysis, you know, could go on for weeks if it's a complex or severe case. Okay, so that's a crash course on the 5 companies and the current situations that they were dealing with at the time I started conducting the research. And so after speaking with them and after interviewing, I came up with sort of a framework on how these organizations could understand if they're using social technology, what would the impact of that social technology be on those various business processes that they're actually seeking to gain some value from. And so, you know, based on these case studies with various organizations, I identified 6 key practices that I believe can significantly influence organizational adoption and use of social software technology from an understanding the impact perspective. So let me just take you briefly through what that framework is. So first and foremost, through the tone of my description of these companies, you could tell that they actually had an idea in mind, a process in mind that needed improvement. And that's framework step 1, to look at an organization who doesn't understand where they want to gain value from these technologies often leads to, of course, a lack of knowing what's the impact that they're having. So identifying that up front helps set the tone and helps set the pace for knowing whether or not the software that you're bringing in-house or that you're utilizing is actually making any effort, any significant impact on what you're trying to accomplish. So they identified processes up front. The second thing that they did is that they measured process performance. So this has to be done before any change to the process gets done, so you understand what your baseline is. So prior to making any changes in their work, technology, or behavior, they went and identified key metrics that help describe how that process was performing and in its current state. And step 3, they remodeled the process, understanding what technology enablement could happen. How can that process flow change to reflect the fact that they may have now new technologies available to them that could help change that process to either streamline it, make it more efficient, and what that new process would look like. As a part of this, they also have to set, step 4, expectations with those who are recipients of this process or involved in it, and educate them so that they know how to use the technology and what is available to them and how their process should be changed or modified so that moving forward, they can comply with this new process. And of course, step 5, they have to measure the process again. So did they, do in step 2, list out all of the measurements that were key to understanding how successful the process is? And then again in 5, how did those metrics look after this new process had been implemented? And finally, step 6, continue to take new evaluations over time to guide any process changes and determine how performance is improving overall. So it's not just a one and done, continue to improve that process based on new feedback, based on new measurements. So that's the highest level of the framework. So let's take a quick look at what, some of that, those processes were from the different organizations that we talked about already. So with CEMEX, remember they were focused on an alternative fuels global initiative, and that's one of 6 areas where they were trying to make global changes, but we focused for the purpose of this study on just one of those, so that was the overall process. For Bosch, again, it was the custom or localization request, 1 out of 25, use cases that they wanted to improve. We studied one of them. For the Customs Administration of the Netherlands, it was how customs officers are conducting package inspections. For the Salvation Army, it was planning an international conference. And for Alpha Software, it was customer support tickets and resolution of those customer support issues. So in step 1, they identified their process. In step 2, they measured that process's performance. So for CEMEX, they took a look at 3 things. How much fossil fuels were used in production? On average, it was 5 to 7%. They had, savings associated to alternative fuel initiative. Well, they didn't have one yet, so there was nothing at that point in time. And when it came to how they ranked compared to their competitors in their use of alternative fuels, they ranked very low. In fact, I think they were quoted to me as saying they didn't even make the list. So that was something that they wanted to change. For Bosch, it was how long does it take to respond to a customer when they have a localization request? And it was 4 to 8 weeks on average. And we also looked at how much content was shared. And we used emails because that was the primary way that they communicated with each other. And there were 61 that were involved in an average process. In the Customs Administration of the Netherlands, we looked at the number of inspections that the average customs officer inspected per day, and that inspections per day, and that was about roughly 8.62. The number of experts that were required to be contacted in order to, take an inspection to completion, and that was just under, 2 on average. And the number of packages that were inspected per day, so about 13.5 packages on average. The Salvation Army, we looked at how long it took to plan the conference, how many emails were involved in planning the conference details, and how many meetings were involved in planning the conference. And for Alpha Software, we looked at the hours spent resolving the issue, almost 30 on average for this one particular case. The number of emails sent and received regarding an issue, and that was close to 30, and the number of meetings required to resolve an issue, and that was just under 6. So we had a baseline, so we understood how these processes were performing before any introduction of social technology. And so I'm going to dive, just in the interest of time, on a couple of these, but you're welcome to, of course, download and read more details in the full document. So let's take a look at step 3 from the perspective of Bosch. So that was case study number 2. So they introduced a social software platform they call Bosch Connect, and enabled employees to connect with each other. This is part of their process remodel, finding and sharing expertise, working on business goals. And they created a community space that allowed people who were involved in customer localization requests to communicate with each other. And the customers of their diesel systems worldwide had access to this community. Now, all the stakeholders that we mentioned earlier, sales, manufacturing, business units, central offices, even groups such as purchasing. And in that community space, the stakeholders had direct access to information regarding the customer inquiry, the stage of the process that it was in, any relevant conversations. It provided a common articulation of who was responsible for which aspects of the process, which often was unknown when they were doing this process through email. Each localization request status was tracked in the community, and the community provided a central co-editable space where the information required was required for management decisions. So the overall localization request process flow stayed the same, but the difference here is that the same approval points and handoff, with the same approval points and handoffs, but the roles were clearly defined, the information on the process and its status were available throughout, and it reduced the need to reach out to individuals one-on-one. So they went from a rough flow that went through primarily through email to a central place where they accessed all of the information related to their localization request. And that's what their community looked like. So folks who were involved in the process would come in as needed. They could see, again, the status of any of the requests that were out there and who they might be. And then they also shared information on, from the sales side, from manufacturing side, and so forth. So let's do one more. So the Customs Administration of the Netherlands, they implemented a social software platform as well. They called Kennis Connect, and so you'll see the references within there. It's called Kennis Connect. And then what that did is it intended to aid knowledge collection and access throughout the customs organization and other relevant departments. So in addition to collecting and sharing knowledge, they also created mobile access so that those customs officers who were on the road had more flexibility in their work environment. So what they did is now the customs officers would begin their day accessing their mobile devices instead of physically driving to the office to pick up paper-based assignments. So literally they could step out the front door of their home and know where they were going to be heading at that moment. Then they traveled to client locations to conduct their inspections. That part of the process stayed the same. But during the inspection, here's where things change. The officers could then use this Kennis Connect platform from their mobile device to access knowledge on procedures. So if they came across illegal objects, they're able to report those right through the tool as opposed to filling out, again, paper forms. And if they came across goods that were unknown, they could look up people in their organization's directory and based on matching of tags or content. So, for example, if a package of medications that came in that was unknown, the customs officer could then search on that drug's name, find people with appropriate expertise. Then the officer can also see if they're online, chat with them immediately, or even call them. So if the person's not online, the office can also, that shows related colleagues who may be able to help. So since all the regions of the Netherlands had access to this community site, all the officers were represented, all the offices were represented in the tool. You may recall earlier I stated that the office locations didn't speak to each other, so this was a way of bringing them all together so that they could share and access knowledge beyond their own specific office. And then they could search and find expertise that were relevant to what they were currently working on. So in this case, their process changed in 3 areas. First, the customs officers received their risk analysis through mobile devices at home rather than by paper in the office. Second, the officers accessed knowledge base directly through the mobile device when questions arose during their audit. And third, the results of the audit were recorded on mobile devices rather than on paper forms. Okay, so next step 4, expectations in education. So as these companies would remodel their process, they would need to communicate. So again, in the case of the customs officers, communicate to those customs officers. How is this process changing? What are the expectations of me in this role now that I'm a part of this organization and I'm going to be using this new site? Also in the case of, Bosch needing to communicate what's expected of the people who are a part of that process, even getting to the point of identifying the roles of people who are involved in the process and actually formalizing that. And so some of the ways in which companies that were involved in this study did this is, one, through top-down. So for the case of Cemex, the messages were delivered from executive management down to the teams executing the processes. Some used a community management approach. So for the case of Bosch, there was a community manager who was assigned to improving this process, and they would be responsible for communicating and educating the expectations of their users. And others used training sessions. In fact, a number of them cited using training sessions specific to the process to help their users understand how to use the tools and how to benefit from them. So, of course, the next step was let's remeasure. Now that we've implemented a new process, how can we gain some benefit? How have we gained some benefit if we've gained any benefit at all? Cemex ended up launching their platform, Shift, and they rolled it out to their employees in different waves. And then over the course of time, within 6 years, they improved their rate of substitution of fossil fuels with comparison to their competitors. So their substitution rate went from 5 to 7% in 2005 timeframe, and now it's at 25 to 27% at a global scale. The initiative also generated $140 million in savings per year and reduced the release of about 1.5 million tons of CO2 to the atmosphere every year. And then as a result, they were also awarded a highest ranking for 2 years in a row for the Global Fuels Award, which recognizes companies in the cement and lime industry. So they were very proud of their results, of course. For Bosch, as a result of the community, the process for those localization requests improved on a number of metrics. So the length of time that it took for Bosch to respond to a customer request went from 4 to 8 weeks down to 6 days. And the number of emails involved in the process went down to 0. They completely eliminated the use of email and completely rely on their community site as a way of having any information shared in the tool rather than in email. For the customs administration, after using Kenis Connect, they increased the number of inspections per day slightly. They also increased the number of experts contacted per day as well, from just about 2 to 2.5. So they were starting to do more outreach with more experts. And then they were able to conduct an additional package inspection on average per day. For the Salvation Army, the length of time to plan their conference dropped almost in half. The numbers of emails required to plan the conference also dropped down to a much smaller number, and the number of meetings that were involved also dropped. And for Alpha Software, the amount of time spent resolving issues dropped almost in half, a little over half as well. And then the number of emails sent and received regarding customer support issues also dropped, and the number of meetings required to resolve an issue dropped. So they are not done, obviously, measuring these processes. They continue to measure these on an ongoing basis to identify where inefficiencies are occurring and to gain even more benefit, especially those who were early on in their adoption of these tools. So for continuous improvement at CEMEX, the process was shared with other global locations to effect a more significant change across the board. As you may recall from the beginning, they had other key initiatives, and so while alternative fuels was one that we discussed, they also used the results of the alternative fuels initiative to help highlight for other groups within the company how they could gain benefit as well. And for Bosch DS, their community continually is, process contributors. They have new processes and modifications that are made based on the interactions that are happening. So this was the first version or the first round of utilizing a new community site as a way of putting this process into a more streamlined fashion, and they're continually evolving that. Okay, so while I mentioned earlier that as a result of these studies and talking with different companies, we also identified some strategies that would help with adoption in general. So in a few cases, resistance, user resistance, not wanting to change the way that people are working came up. And one of the strategies that was leveraged by CEMEX was actually to design user personas based on 12 of the different types of personalities that they have at CEMEX. For example, a senior executive might be one of those personalities. And then they would use those personas to articulate the predispositions that they needed to change and describe ways to sell the social concepts to each of those different personalities, and help showing that they understood who the users were, what their resistance, what was the source of their resistance, and what kinds of strategies could be put in place to help sell them on the idea of using these. And sometimes that meant appealing to their needs specifically, such as wanting to see, benefit rather than, using the tools just for the sake of them. Actually several of them used advocate programs as a way to help business users, help the business understand what user challenges were. So they would recruit social software users who were, advocates for the tool and have them speak on behalf of the technologies and the benefits of them to others in the organization who are perhaps not educated or needed to know why to utilize these tools and in what capacity, and actually help coach them through the process. In other case, one org focused on simplification. So let's get down to very simple use cases, simple use of the technology don't try to do too many at once. Let's focus on one at a time. And so they chose to educate their users that with examples that represented the work that they were already doing, very specific to their role, and that helped them understand how they could adopt the technologies. And then finally, senior management came up almost in all of the companies that I spoke with. So getting them to participate in social tools had a significant impact on adoption in general. Some of the programs that helped with them were having executive-focused education, having them, give them ways to monitor their organizations using these technologies, even reverse mentoring strategies. For example, getting a executive a mentor to help walk them through what it's like to use the technologies, what examples of other executives are utilizing the technologies for, how they can gain benefit, and give them someone to ask questions of that show that they understand what the tool set is capable of doing. Okay, so in summary, while we found that there were a number of strategies that organizations took for adoption, in general, and trying to understand what the impact of these tools are on your organizations, there, again, this 6-step framework: identify the business process that you're looking to improve, measure it, model it based on the supporting technology that you'll have, set expectations of your users and educate them, measure the performance of that process at various intervals, and then improve that process continually based on feedback and performance. So from this, we identified it's possible to understand the impact of social technology investments by identifying these key business processes and measuring them. But I do want to say social software adoption is not, an organizational state that once achieved can be claimed and then dismissed. So these users, their needs are constantly changing. User-generated content, it begins aging the moment that it's shared. And many facets of organizations, such as departments, processes, metrics, product services, they're as dynamic as the people are within them. So it's important for companies to recognize that adoption is ongoing. It requires continual understanding and evaluation and changes in those supporting processes. So the work is not done for these organizations. They are continuing to evaluate the performance of these processes and also taking into consideration the users that they are serving with this technology. So I want to thank, as a part of this presentation, everyone who was involved in helping to conduct this research, my thesis advisor, our program director at MIT SDM, Pat Hale, folks at IBM who've been super supportive of this work over time, Michael Muller of IBM Research, my manager, Heidi Ambler, our general manager, Jeff Schick, and then, of course, all the customers who helped me access their users and provided key insights in interviews, as well as others who helped review the thesis. So with that, I want to thank you for your time and your attention today. And again, remind you 2 ways that you can contact me. One is through my website, where you can also download my thesis. MIT has not posted it yet to the site where you can download theses, but you are able to download it on my website. I have permission from them to do so. So feel free to ask any questions that you have of me. And then you can also contact me through Twitter. More than happy to answer any questions that you have about this work at this time.
Thank you, Susie. We have a few questions already. For those of you who joined us late, if you would like to ask Suzanne a question as part of this webinar today, just please type it right into the chat section and address it to everyone. The first question is from Catherine O'Neill, who asks, were you able to segment out the improvements achieved as a result of the process change versus the tool/technology change? Or were they one and the same, i.e., the tool enabled the process?
That's a great question. And in this case, I was studying the result of the technology on the process. So whenever a process was suggested to me that there was no intention of using technology for, I did not study it given the scope of what I was trying to look at. I do think that it's also valuable to look at processes and whether or not there were improvements to that process, regardless of whether technology was an enabler or was positioned to be an enabler of that process.
Thank you. From Corey Miller, I have found work-based social media type interaction distracting. Was there a study or measurement of this type in your research?
Oh, interesting. An angle on that in terms of distractions we did not look at in this particular research. In fact, many of the organizations that I had spoken with prior to selecting the 5 that I went forward with were finding quite the opposite. They were trying to get more of their users on board and trying to grow the presence of social technology in the workplace rather than seeing any overwhelmingness related to it. So we were at a point where many of them had just been starting, and so they weren't quite at a level where there is that distraction that you're probably experiencing. And I do believe now that these companies that I looked at, again, trying to grow their usage of social tools, there are many who already have achieved some level of maturity of using social tools within their environment, and I absolutely agree. There's just an overwhelming amount of information that gets shared within them, even if it's a company-only tool, if you do have high levels of adoption. And so, as a provider of these types of technologies, we come up with ways to mitigate that within our software platforms. Can we provide a more relevant set of content for you to be aware of, rather than sort of giving you everything that's happening within the software system, and basing that based on social analytics such as your preferences and your needs. So I do, it didn't come up as much in these case studies, but I definitely see a need to provide more focus rather than distraction for users, and some technologies are working on ways to make an improvement there.
Okay, thank you. Here's a question from Mark Meyer. Most of your cases seem to focus on social networking to enable/power internal business process improvement. The Bosch case was the most interesting because it creates/provides a mechanism for customer feedback, another channel for input into product development. This would seem to be more transformational. What other examples of user engagement through social networking in the innovation process do you know about or can recommend? Are these on the IBM public case reference site? Thank you.
Well, so I would say that there, and thank you for the comment, Mark. Certainly the Bosch case was very interesting and also showed how, the user base is involved in the pushing of a process forward, and can actually help to, rally around making the output to the customer come faster. In all of the cases, end users were involved. So, for example, in the case of, CEMEX, while you didn't see an example of the community here, the people who were involved in the Alternative Fuels Initiative went all the way down to the individual researchers at various manufacturing sites who had expertise and knowledge that they were sharing within the community. With the case of the Dutch tax office, went all the way down to their tax officers, who were the ones really the feet on the street trying to move the process forward for Alpha Software, through their customer support organization. It was the customer support reps themselves who were members of the community site. So these were the examples that I utilized here for the case study. There are certainly lots online that can talk about various different ways that social software has transformed their organization, and we do have a case reference site you can go to. The URL I can share with you in the meeting when I'm done sharing, presenting. If you stay on the meeting site for a couple minutes, I will get the URL pasted in there. Or if you do a quick Google search on IBM Enterprise Social Software Customer References, that actually will take you to a site that has videos and case studies of various different companies and how they're utilizing social technology to make transformative changes within their organization.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Kendra White. How do you recommend, or how have other companies used, balancing findability of information and people collaboration with the need to keep information private, both internally and externally in some cases?
Yes, this is one of the reasons why there's a need for a focus on helping people understand what the benefits are and also understanding what the constraints are of the technologies that they're utilizing. And it's often an inhibitor in terms of adoption by end users who are often concerned, I don't want to share a document that I'm going to expose any information, that I don't mean to for my organization. And they really just want to know from a governance standpoint, what does my organization need? What do we suggest people to share, and what do we restrict people from sharing? So I think for each company, it differs. Some companies that are part of more regulated industries, they may have more restraint in terms of what they wish employees even to share with each other internally. In other industries, they may be more open to sharing and transparency and visibility. It's also part of the culture, even within an industry. There may be some companies who are more apt to share and be visible. I think that's why executive support has been such a key enabler of getting social adoption, because we see the leadership, and if the leadership is part of the change and the transformation, then the employees then feel more comfortable participating in that as well. So in terms of privacy, it is the idea of keeping information secure has often held people back from utilizing the tools, but simply being upfront and open with as an organization about what you expect your employees to do and how you expect them to handle different types of information can help alleviate that. And, for example, IBM, we have a very public social media guidelines that we've used within the company for, I think over a decade at this point. And that helps us know, as IBMers, what can we blog about, what can't we blog about, what can we talk about publicly, what should we talk about internally, are we allowed to share, a slide presentation that has customer names in it, internally, for example. And knowing that kind of helps set the comfort level of what you are able to share and what you're not, to help alleviate some of the issues associated with sharing.
Okay, we have time for a couple of more questions. This one, it takes the prior question to another level of granularity. It's from Patrick Gustafson. Are the social media type interactions logged and kept like emails, and can they be subpoenaed if there are legal issues?
Great question. So yes, many organizations have a requirement to keep record of everything that has been shared in a social networking site. Again, I'll put my vendor hat on. We've actually integrated with some third parties that do compliance and monitoring, and they sell solutions that integrate with our tools so that anything that's being shared within the tool gets tracked, and a company can go back and audit based on a key term. Let's say you're working with a company that you acquire, and later on there's some legal action. You need to go back and find anything that was shared at all in their social site regarding that company. Well, being able to access all of that information, even if it's been deleted, even if the comment somebody made had been deleted, knowing that that information existed at some point and which eyes saw the information that was being shared. So yes, it's true that organizations often do need to keep record of content that's being shared within a social site, just as they do with email, just as they do with chat, and it's treated as a source of content in the case of legal infringement or in those cases. I actually don't know personally of any cases where where they've been subpoenaed. I think that tends to probably be more private information, but if you know of any, feel free to share them in the chat room. I'm sure other people might be interested.
Okay, and before we get to the last question, I'd like to just let those of you who need to leave now know about our next webinar. That will be on November 16th. The presenter is Jillian Wisniewski, who's a captain in the U.S. Army, a systems dynamic instructor at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, and an SDM alumnus. The topic will be a systems analysis of tactical intelligence in the U.S. Army. You will be sent a link to registration and more info in the follow-up email to Suzanne's webinar. Now, the last question is from Christopher Hoffman, who says, I have experienced a social networking tool / site growth in a company, and while there are several success stories, it seems that as time passes and other communities are created and managed independently, kind of a systems of systems set, the quality and effectiveness of content degrades. How have you seen this best mitigated so that value is maintained?
I think that this happens very frequently. In organizations, there's a lot of momentum initially behind having these social tools, and the momentum dies down as it would if there isn't a true purpose for the tools and that people aren't gaining value from them to actually keep them moving forward. This is why I think the first step that any organization should take is to identify those business processes. What is it that we actually want to use the software for? This isn't a matter of if you build it, they will come, because they might come immediately, but then they're going to go away if they don't actually get anything out of using the tool or using the site. So where I've seen more of the quality and more of effective collaboration has been around a process, around trying to have some goal or end state in mind by using the tools, and then continually improving that process and using that community site as a source of, sort of the heart of the process. This is where we all go to, make this happen. If the process is important to the company, then it will, the interactions will be higher quality. If this is a process that's not important, it will soon, sort of tell the tale that those who don't view it as being such a high priority aren't really involved in making it better, making it improve. So if you net it down to focusing in on key business processes that the company has a strategic interest in, then I believe those are the ones that will end up having the most quality of information, the most use going forward. And thanks everybody, Chris, Patrick, Kendra, Mark, Corey, Catherine, for your questions. They were great.
On behalf of SDM, I'd like to thank Suzanne Livingston for delivering a very thought-provoking presentation, and to thank all of you who attended for your interest. As mentioned earlier, you will be sent a link to the recording of today's webinar in about 1 week, along with the speaker's contact information. The next presentation, entitled A Systems Analysis of Tactical Intelligence in the U.S. Army, will be delivered on November 16th by Captain Jillian Wisniewski, who is a systems dynamic instructor at West Point and an SDM alumna. You will be sent more information when we send you the follow-up email mentioned earlier. We hope you can join us.